talk about is one of the project that I'm working on at the Oxford University School of Archaeology, and it's a database that we're using CRM ontology, and we're using Arches software. I'm going to talk about it more, but it's more like a case study of how we started to use CRM in order to be able to model mainly our archaeology, but also conservation and damage assessment and data. My background, just to give you quickly, is in archaeology and heritage conservation and management, but I spent a lot of time working with different inventory systems and especially with the CDOC CRM as an ontology that was used in these different systems. So what I'm going to quickly talk about today is to give you a quick introduction to endangered archaeology in the Middle East and North Africa, EAMENA project, and the database. And then I'm going to talk about how we use CDOC CRM in order to model our archaeology and also monitoring and condition assessment data. And in the end, what I want to talk about is to how we can possibly propose to extend CRM in order to be able to map data coming from risk assessments of sites, and also I'm guessing the museums it also is a big requirement. And so in the project we're using satellite imagery and Google Earth mainly to map, to understand what are or record archaeological sites in the Middle East and North Africa. There are about 20 countries starting from Mauritania and going to Iran. And we're recording what we think that there are archaeology, both known sites, but also mainly the focus is to find the sites or the places that we think are archaeology, but they're not recorded already in any inventories. So we created a database, and I'm going to talk about, it's not, we didn't start from the scratch. We used Arches software or platform as the database, and we extended on that, and we created this EAMENA database now that is used as a repository, and it's open access for researchers and archaeologists to use. And from one side, what we're doing is we identify sites and archaeology. So we're doing archaeological assessments, again, mainly using satellite imagery, Google Earth, but also when we have publication reports, using of the reports. And from the other side, we're doing monitoring of these sites to understand what are the changes that happen to the sites over time, what are the disturbances, threats. And mainly when the project was started, this was done remotely, again with the use of Google Earth. But now with the second stage of project that started in end of 2016, we wanted also to be able to add record coming from monitoring of sites in the field. So when you're going to the sites and rapidly doing condition assessment and risk assessment. So we didn't want to, as I said, invent any wheel, so we decided to use Arches database as a platform, and Arches, as Rob explained yesterday, we developed by Getty Conservation Institute and World Monument Fund, and it's purposely built to be used by archaeologists or heritage professionals, and the data coming from these heritage professionals. And it's open source, web-based, and one of the most important thing that we think is important with Arches is standard-based, and it's used CDOC CRM to model, as an ontology to model data, and we started to use Arches and extended it and modified it based on our needs. So what Arches allows users to do is to easily you can modify and customize it based on how you want to use the database. What I'm going to talk about mainly today is the models or the graphs that we used from previous version of Arches version 3. Now they moved to a new version, Arches 4, and that's what we're doing now. We have to migrate and move to the new version, which is very even more user-friendly, and you can use the interface itself. And again, Rob quickly showed you yesterday and how you can use the interface itself to model your data, so you don't need to do in a back end, model your graphs, code it, and then have your form. It's now very easily can be used from the database itself. So in our database, the information that we're recording, the archaeology side, we're recording information from what is to identify if the thing that we're recording we think is archaeology, where it's located, the time period or the time span and the period of the site, how we interpret it as an archaeology, forms and other data that goes with archaeology assessment. And from the other side, we do condition assessment, so very rapid. At the beginning, when its project started, it was designed to do define the only disturbances, what are the actual problems that you see, and quickly identify threats, any future problem to the site. And also you can upload any what is called in Arches and also EAMENA related information resources, any photos, maps, or bibliography information that you want to add to your system. Everything in the database is mostly based on field and controlled vocabulary. There is very limited places where you can add free text, and this is because our project is between three different universities, Oxford, Durham, and Leicester. We're more than 20 researchers working and using the database, so we wanted everything to be very standardized and all the terms to be defined, and all of us as researchers use the same vocabularies. And now that we moved in doing training in different countries in the Middle East and North Africa, working with different departments of archaeology, we also wanted to encourage using of the same terms for the same concept. So as I think Thanasis mentioned that as part of your first workshop, you touched this issue of controlled vocabulary and how to define a concept. Like for conservation here, if we're talking about a cause of decay or disturbance as a construction, so define this construction, what we mean by construction, and then you can add, Arches software allows you to add as much as you want different terms that different institutions or different organizations use to describe the same thing. And also, because we're using the database, or we're working with a lot of in the countries in the Middle East and North Africa, for each of our terms that we use in the database, we have also Arabic as well. So the database is both in searchable and usable both in English and Arabic, and you can add different languages. Now we're thinking to add French as well, and then other languages as well. Currently in the database we have more than 2,500 records, and they're mainly heritage records, archaeology, or what we think they're archaeology, and also information resources, photos, maps, etc. From end of 2016, the second stage of the project started when we got funding from Culture Protection Fund, and we wanted to work with countries in the Middle East and North Africa to be able to train this, work with different departments of archaeology and add a training, a capacity building component to our project. So we decided that other than the capability of the database to be used as a research tool, to add capabilities to be used as conservation and management tool. And that was when we wanted to add data coming from field conservation or condition assessment and field risk assessment in order to prioritize sites and also be able to give recommendations for any mitigations or conservation strategies. So we started again to look at the graphs that the version 1 of EAMENA had, that was extended using extended from Arches graphs, and try to make the existing graph more CRM compliant, and also add branches or areas to be able to record data coming from these on-the-ground assessment. To give you a few examples, I'm going to talk about a few examples of what I mean in redesigning the graphs to be more CRM compliant, or do this, or to be able to record this condition information or assessment information. So for anything, when we record information about archaeology, this is an example of the page or the database online form that we use to add information about the site. And one thing that I think is powerful in EAMENA database is for any information that you add, there is a concept of certainty that we can add to that field. So if, especially because we're using aerial photos and satellite imagery, when we think that something is an archaeology, but we're not 100% sure whether it is an archaeology or not. So there is this concept of certainty that goes with most of the fields that we have in the database. And in order to map that using CDOC CRM, at the beginning of version 1 of EAMENA, most of these new terms or new things that we wanted, or the project wanted to add to the database, this more generic class of type E55 that was explained yesterday was used. But when we started to look back again to the graphs, we started to mainly also look at the CRM extensions to see what are the more appropriate classes to be used to model what we have in the database, instead of using this overuse of E55 as a type to define everything that we record. So these are, again, it was explained yesterday, George explained them to you, that the extensions of CDOC CRM, and the ones that we started to use for our project or database is CRM-in for argumentation model, the scientific observation model, and building, because of the condition assessment that we're doing for monuments and building on the sites, and also the geo extension, and that is mainly because, and that's to locate the location of the site or place. And if you remember maybe from yesterday, that E53 or place is a class to be used for location in CRM core, but because we're using satellite imagery again, and the location is not 100% accurate, and we're using this, it's not the coordinates coming physically from the ground, but we have this satellite imagery in between us and the actual location. So we're using the a spatial coordinate for recording location. And I just want to now add here that I'm not an expert in CRM. I spend a lot of time to understand what are the best classes or properties to use to map our data, and spend some time questioning people, the experts from CRM. So I think it's better that if you have any suggestions or comments, questions, you can jump in and say, no, this is not the way to do it. And now we're in a phase, now that we're in a phase that we're moving from V3, our Arches V3 to V4, so we're remodeling or kind of adjusting our data models to be able to do the transfer between the two Arches 3 to Arches 4, so it's a good time also for us to make any changes if it's needed. So when I showed you in two slides before, this concept of certainty and how to map it in the V1 with the overuse of E55, then for our version 2 we started to look at inf or argumentation extension, and decided that what we're saying as a certainty is a person belief that whether what we're recording is true or not true, or anything between from true or not. So now for recording certainty, we're using the I2 belief, and that's connected to a belief of a person. So if you're logged in as a person who is doing data entry, and this and you're identifying a site and you think it's an archaeology and you want to record it, and if it's in your own belief, then the assessor is you, and there is no need for you to add your name as a person who has that belief. But because a lot of times we're using that data comes from outside, from other people, so there is a capability for in the user interface that you can add names of the person who had the belief that this thing is archaeology, or the form of this place is what. So now is the certainty is modeled based on this belief system coming from inf and extension in CRM. And now I want to quickly move to the condition and damage assessment part that we started to add to the database. And as I explained, that we wanted the database to be able to also record the data, not only doing the assessment using remote assessment, but more detailed assessment coming from ground survey, and to be able to be used, the database to be used as a tool also for decision making, for recommending what are the conservation mitigation priorities and activities, and how to be able to prioritize these activities. So one thing that we did looking at how to do this detailed assessment was to redefine what we call archaeology, or what we use E27, how it's defined in CDOC CRM as a site or archaeological site. So we kept that heritage site or heritage place to be used as our first level. So anything that we want to record as a first level of what we think is an area or a larger area of archaeology we use this E27, and then we add more layers to levels to the heritage place. So we say this place is composed of different features. So if you have a settlement, it's composed of different individual site elements or monuments, and for that we use this E24 physical human-made now thing, and not man-made. And then for each feature also we go down another level of defining different what we say components of this of the feature, which are very related to when you want to do a condition assessment. So when you're looking at different walls, roofs, so different components of a building or a monument that you want to do your assessment. For the first level, heritage place level, is where a user can use to do a quick, rapid assessment, and that's mainly to use satellite imagery to identify the things that you think are disturbances and threats. For heritage feature level, so one level down, when you're talking about one component, one structures or site elements, is where now you'll be able to do more detailed risk assessment. And for the component, where you're looking at different components of each buildings, and that's where we use building extension to be able to record exterior, interior, so all the different components of each buildings, and that's where we do more detailed damage assessments. So for each of the resource graphs that we have in the database, there are information about location coming from CRM core, but also geo extension, general information about resource summary, the name, heritage classification, assessment summary. That's where we say that what is the actual activity that we're doing, if we're adding information about archaeology, whether we're doing condition assessment, risk assessment, and the date of that assessment, because we wanted the database to be able to record different condition assessment over time, so you can monitor the place, so as a snapshots of monitor or conducting condition assessment. And then it has a branch for archaeology assessment, modification and construction, measurement and condition assessment is a part that I'm gonna give you a few examples of how we modeled this damage and risk assessment. This is not visible. I have graphs that I can show you if you're interested later in how these different branches they're coming. Again, this is for version 3 of Arches. It's slightly different in version 4. So one thing that we wanted to model using CRM as ontology and for our database was to, if you're using the first level, and also it applies to other level as well, that this monitoring of change over time. So for each disturbance that you identify in the database, like this example is from a fort in Jordan, that was destroyed sometime between 2013 and 2014. And that we know when we use Google Earth and we go back in time from 2014 and we jump into 2013, we see that at some point between these two dates, the fort was destroyed. we don't know the exact cause of sorry, no, not the cause. We know that it was bulldozed, so we record that bulldozing as a cause of this disturbance, and we see that the structure now is collapsed, and the collapse is the effect, and the time span that happened sometimes between 2013 and 2014. And again, it has a certainty of the person that was doing this assessment, whether that person is certain that this bulldozing was the cause of the damage. So we're using this notion of time span that I think also was explained yesterday, and we define 3 different options in the database that you can record at anything that happened between 2 set dates, or anything that happened before today or before a date that you know, or after. For more building assessment, and when you go to the site to do, and again, what I want to emphasize here, we're not with the database all this information, either when I say that it's detailed and from the field, they're all based on field observation. So we're not encouraging any technical or devices to be used. So you go to the site and you do a quick first round observation using forms, photographs, maybe a GPS device, to understand what are the main problems and what we call in the database disturbances as a cause, and then what you see as a damage, and what might happen in the future to the place as threats. But with the more detailed assessment, we wanted also to be able to say what is the severity of each of damage that we record, and what is the extent, how much of the area that we're assessing is affected by that damage. Like for, this is an example of the same old house in Lebanon, in North Lebanon in Batroun. That the cellar that we're looking at, there is a tree growing out of the roof. So the tree is the cause, what we record in the database as a cause of disturbance, and structural damage is the actual effect of the disturbance. And then we give to that a severity and extend how much of this of the area of the cellar that we're talking about is affected by the tree. So in order to use CRM to model this information, so we say that we use the E14 condition assessment, that is in CRM core, is defined as a class, and also the next one, condition state E3, is also already existed in the CRM core, that you want to, when you want to model state of the condition of your object or archaeology, and then for recording effect, or what you actually see as a result of the damage, we're using the psi extension, and we record this effect as an observation. So the structural damage as a effect is an observation that was again made. You have the assessor or the person actor class that you can add to each of these nodes. And the cause of the disturbance is modeled based on events, or E5, from CRM core. So we're saying that if the example, I'm going back to the example of the tree, if that's the cause of the damage, which was structural damage, is coming out of this events or E5 node. And then, because again for condition assessment also we have this notion of certainty, whether we're sure, it's our belief, or how certain we are that this tree is causing problem to the structure. We again using this I2 or belief system for cause as well. So we're saying that the cause assigned a belief, and the belief that is a proposition and is coming from outside XML sheet, that it's a tree, and whether we're definite, and it has a range of possible, probable, definite, that the tree is the cause, and then you can add the assessor, that who's doing the assessment, and you can add the name of the assessor. For the evaluation of the damage, to say what is the extent or the severity of damage, we're using E16 measurements, and that's where maybe we can have a discussion later with experts in CRM, that whether you think that this is correct or a way of recording extent. Because what we say that this condition state was measured by E16 measurement, and that's how we do a record or model evaluation. And this measurements assign a severity, and your severity you have from heavy to low, and has different type of extent from 1 to 10% to 91 to 100%. And another thing that we're recording also in the database is whether the damage is ongoing or stable, decreasing or increasing. And that's also recording as a type of the state. For each of, from one side for condition assessment and also for risk assessment that we're recording, we're allowing users to record recommendations and any intervention plans that they think that needs to be taken. So for that, we're using a relatively new node that was introduced in CRM core. It's E100 activity plan. It's no,
not from the core.
It isn't from the core.
Is it?
No, there was the carry on with the talk.
Okay. No, but maybe we can have a discussion if you but later or not. Okay. So this is to recommend any activities that you want to undertake. So the type of activity, when you can, in the database, you can say whether it's a mitigation strategies for anything that might happen in the future and you want to block that to happen, or any conservation maintenance activity or emergency activity. And then you assign you identify the actual recommendation. So what is the recommendation? Removal of plants, vegetation, and what is the priority of that interventions to be done. And now I want to quickly talk about the risk assessment part. That why it's important, and now I think nowadays more and more important is both museum studies and heritage management, is to have this component of risk management or risk assessment added to the management of your site, or how to, the things that you need to do to for the management of the site. And not, this is a circle or the cycle of risk assessment that we use in heritage management for mainly for emergency assessment, but also it's applied to before disaster, or how to mitigate a disaster, or mitigate the effect of disaster if the disaster itself cannot be stopped. So we wanted some components of this risk assessment cycle to be applied into, or to be able to be recorded into the database. So mainly the risk assessment part, that things that, or the things that you need to plan or have in mind to have your risk assessment strategies. So what are these components, or what are these criteria that you need to think about and also be able to record in the database. So main concepts that we used for risk assessment part of the database is to identify the threats, and threats are defined as a potential damage or harm that can happen in the future, and they can have different factors from natural to human. Actual potential impact, so what is the actual impact that we think that might happen in the future? Risk itself, the probability of that this certain type of damaging event will happen in the future. Evaluation of the risk, so identify what is the severity, probability, and extent. And two other concepts that we wanted to be able to record in the database are exposure and vulnerability, and those are because threat by itself might not be significant without exposure and vulnerability. And if I want to very quickly define that for you, is that if the the example of museum is next to a river, risk of flood that might happen to the museum might be high. So you need to have risk mitigation strategies for flood. But then if the museum has different level from underground to ground to higher level, the exposure of objects or materials that there are in the underground are more exposed to this water, to the threat of water damage. So that's where we wanted to be able to look to record exposure as a place or location of in our case, archaeology or heritage that are more exposed to threat. And vulnerability, for this example, we can say that if the objects in the museums are, if you have books are more vulnerable to water. So if books is in the underground, vulnerability is high, exposure is high, so risk is higher. The concepts that we wanted, this is going back to example of the building in building assessment or risk assessment, that for threats, if we're talking about the building as a whole feature, lack of maintenance or neglect might be your threat. And exposure, talking about the cellar, so the cellar is the place that we're talking about. Vulnerabilities are neglect, potential impact might be collapse, and probability, severity, and risk level, so likely, severe, high. So now we had to think about how to model this risk assessment component. One thing that we thought was at the beginning to use, especially for doing just identifying threats, not going into detail of risk assessment, but just saying that what are the threats that are affecting archaeology or monuments, was to use, again, belief as something that might happen in the future. So again, using CRM-Inf as an inference making of a person and a belief of that person that this threat of flood might happen in the future. This is again something that we can discuss later, whether I had a quick talk with Dominic yesterday, and he was saying that that's also an interesting thing to talk and see whether this threat can be, belief can be used for things that hasn't happened yet, but it might happen in the future. But if we want to record the whole concept of risk, as I'm going to be recording risk, threats, everything that hasn't happened yet and want to happen in the future, this use of belief was limited. So we started to think about what if there is a need to add this extension or a few, not just extension, a few classes or properties in order to be able to define things that hasn't happened yet and might happen in the future. So CRM has this, when I started to read about it, they have this rules of to understand whether there is a need for a new class or new properties, that says the introduction of a new class should comply with the minimality modeling principle of CDOC CRM. A class is not declared unless it is required as a domain or range of a property not appropriate to its superclass. And it's mainly to answer the question that whether the new class, and as you remember that yesterday when it was explained that classes are like a noun and properties are as verbs. So if the class that we think is missing from this CDOC CRM, if it needs a new property or a new verb, if we're looking for a verb to define these things and we can't find it in the CDOC and it's not available in higher class, then if the answer to that is yes, if there is no property, then we can think about, so now maybe there is a need for that class to be added. So what we thought, and that's the work I did with my colleague, Andrea Zerbini, who sadly passed away recently, is to, if when you're doing condition assessment, you predict or foresee something that might happen in the future. So this prediction and is a property that's missing from CRM. So that could be one possible property to be added to the either core or extensions to predict anything that might happen, and in this case potential risk state that might happen in the future, and this potential risk is evaluated by risk prediction evaluation. And this evaluation, we have a notion of severity, probability, extent, and risk itself here can be, if we say that belief can be used to map, to model risk and threat, risk itself is a belief that whether the risk level is high, low, and our certainty in this risk belief. And from the other side, this potential risk state could be produced or resulted by, and this is another question mark, that whether we can use events for a future event that might happen, that I don't think it's appropriate to use that, or then whether there is a need for a new class for possible future events. We started to have define the superclass of this new proposals with the scope note. I don't want to go into detail of these, but these are the things that maybe if a few of you or some of you are interested to talk about more this risk assessment, maybe we can talk about in the afternoon and see what you think and whether you think that it's needed to add these new classes and properties and how is best to define them. So I have this, and we can use them, define these few classes that we thought might be used as a way to define our risk assessment. Thank you.
That's great, thank you very much. And there's a certain tragedy about this project, because you always describe things that have either been destroyed or are about to be destroyed. But nevertheless,
yes,
very important work.
That's the name of the project.
One thing I want to say is that approaching modeling, especially with the CRM, isn't an easy thing.
No.
And I've been involved for a few years. I'm not confident when I talk about these things. So the last thing everyone should worry about is whether this is correct. The good thing is that this is all happening and that we're here to discuss it. So I wouldn't worry about it. But do we have any questions for Azadeh?
It's not really a question. I was just sort of thinking, if you're looking to model risk, do you need to worry about context? So I'm just sort of saying is that if you're modeling risk so that you can check if something's going to happen, if a war breaks out, then the risk would change. So effectively you could look at modeling the risk of something happening in peacetime and the risk of it happening in wartime. So the risk changes based on the context. It depends on how you use it. I was just wondering if worrying about context could be helpful.
Yes, so that's why I'm in that cycle. So things that we wanted to add was to before disaster happens and after, and one of the disasters, war or conflict when it happens. So this ability of the database to record things in time slots. So now, when the disaster hasn't happened, you have a list of defined risks and how to mitigate the result. Like we work in Lebanon. So in Lebanon, conflict might happen. So what are the things that they need to have in mind for their specific sites that are located in specific locations? So how to mitigate the possible impact, and when that happens at that time, then it changes, of course. Then in that context, you change your strategies.
I'm thinking along the lines of, war is a risk, obviously, you want mitigation for it. But if you start thinking of the smaller risks, so what's the risk of a building being damaged or looted or stolen? That risk of that happening would change depending on what's happening around you.
Yes.
Your mitigation strategy might change.
Might change as well.
Because what I'm thinking of is, if you're doing work to model something, you start to need to think about how it's going to be used after you're doing the modeling. So if you have a computer system that says, this is what you have to worry about today. Okay, I need to worry about this site, this site. If war breaks out, the things you need to worry about that day may change. So it's almost the paradigm of your risk changes if something happening.
Yeah.
So if you are looking to model risk at the moment from the start, I don't know if it may well be useful to consider that complexity.
No, I understand.
Because how the risk modeling gets used later may be different. But it's not an easy thing to model.
No,
so
and then you have to.
Yeah, we're in a similar situation of wanting to do measurements in context. So the easy one is what's your weight, and it's different if you're on the moon or if you're on Earth. But how you model the context of the dimension
is a difficult one. Yeah. No, thank you.
Sorry, again, this isn't really a question, but following on from what Joe said about kind of the context of risk, actually, in a lot of ways, it's about the security and kind of forward planning. And recently, I was at ISCO UK, which is the International Society of Knowledge Organization, the UK chapter, and the chair of that, David Haynes, is currently doing a PhD looking on building an ontology of risk, and his project is within data security and intelligence security. So I think maybe
that might be an interest. Yes. No, that's thank you.
It's really nice work. I was just wondering if you have plans or you're exploring the data integration possibilities with sort of government institutions or something. You can imagine that if you could link this up with the public works department or something like that, you might make interesting. So you've identified things like there was a fort and there wasn't a fort. We even know that they used a bulldozer to make that fort no longer exist. And then it would be even more interesting to know who did it and punish them. To do so, I think it wouldn't be impossible. You can imagine, like in Qatar, they built a big database for forward planning where they are doing consistent survey, and then they try to not run highways through major archaeological zones. So you could also imagine, like, you could find densities of permits that were issued or people who were likely to be in possession of bulldozers and work with authorities to try to dissuade people from bulldozing or other.
Yeah. No. With the countries that we're working with and giving trainings, we're also doing with a few of the countries working with their data and doing implementation. So and they're Yemen, Palestine, Jordan. Now we're actually in the process of implementing, but there are other countries, Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, that we're working with for the training of the database and use of this sort of methodology for the management. So we're using also the data coming from the countries, but they're in a, so it's based on up to the country to country plans or their thought of how they want their data to be shared. Because now if you go to our database, there are some information that you can access without having access to the database, but then if you ask for a login, and if the login granted, then you can get more. So it's kind of, we're trying to do this integration of data coming from actual governments or local authorities, but it's based on country by country, but yes.
Can I have to follow up?
Yes.
I just wondering, because it gets into like, really important issues, and there's, some interesting ethical questions that I guess come along. And so, like, anecdotally, recently I've had friends who've been approached by a new military section of the British Army whose job will be to, they'll be the archaeologists, they'll be embedded with the forces, and when they'll go in, they'll be asked to make assessments like, well, now we're going to be near archaeology, so what should we prioritize? Like, if we're going to blow it up, is there anything we should go and get especially first? I mean, seriously, that's what's going to be asked, the kinds of judgments are going to be asked to make. And so I wonder if you've, already run into those, I mean, this is the kind of data that could be used by such forces, and is that a good thing or a bad thing?
That's a very ethical question. And for our project, for the EAMENA, we decided that creating a list is a very dangerous thing to do. I understand that it has uses, because at some point you need to have a list of things, at least that you can't protect everything, so there needs to be, personally, that's my personal opinion, that at some point you need to have the list, and then the question of how to create that list. But as a project, the approach is and when I talk about priorities, especially for the database, is just priority to recommend actions before having the value or importance of the archaeology in mind. So we're not doing any value judgment or assessments in the database, but of course the data coming out when you do search or research on the database and you get the area that you're interested in, then you'll be able to get the data from the database that these are 1,000 sites in your area, and then, but you need to be able to add that information of whatever criteria that you want to choose in order to save those sites. I mean, whether it's because of their value, because of the proximity, I mean, different criteria that you have in mind, but that is one thing that we don't do in the database, but can be exported information from the database and then used in other platforms. Yeah.
That's great, thank you very much. In the afternoon we will have a little bit of time to talk about specific modeling issues, so some of these things we can discuss.
Okay.